I hope that you were able to read through Romans chapter 2 before this lesson. Remember the flow of Romans thus far. In Romans 1:17, Paul states the thesis of his letter, the purpose statement, where he begins to develop the argument of the gospel. Paul states some very crucial points in Romans 1:17. He says that the gospel reveals a righteousness that is from God, not a righteousness that an individual can muster up and attain to themselves, but a righteousness that comes down to them and is imputed, given to them from God, a right standing, a right condition before God. That righteousness is received and applied to every person by the means of faith, by trusting and believing in the Lord Jesus Christ, that his life, death, and resurrection is the very payment for their sins. So Paul says that this righteousness comes from God, it is received by faith, and then Paul begins in the second half of Romans chapter 1 to answer the question why a righteousness from God is even needed. And he goes on to develop and to say that this is necessary, a righteousness from God is necessary because of the wrath of God that is now being revealed to humanity because they suppress the truth in their wickedness. And Paul goes into great detail to talk about the gross immorality of sin. Now Paul comes to Romans chapter 2, and Paul begins to address specifically the Jewish believers. He begins to speak about the Jewish people. Really, in the mind of the biblical readers, there's really two types of people before the life of Christ. There's Jew and Gentile. There's two groups of people, those who are God's chosen people and those who are not. And Paul here begins to address the mind of the Jew. So Paul says, therefore, you have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. So when he says that, when Paul does this in Romans chapter 2, verse 1, what he's actually doing is showing us and revealing to us that the people group that he was referring to in Romans chapter 1 was actually the Gentiles. He was describing the sinful condition of Gentiles in verses 18 through 32 in Romans chapter 1. And now in Romans chapter 2, Paul begins to address the Gentile people. And he says to them, hey, don't think that because you're Jewish and you pass judgment on Gentiles, don't think that you stand righteous before God just because you're Jewish. He goes on and he begins now in Romans chapter 2 to go through systematically and point to the reality that Jewish people are just as guilty before God as non-Jewish people, as the Gentiles. Romans chapter 2 has four major sections in it. They are verses 1 through 11, and then verses 12 through 16, verses 17 through 24, and then verses 25 through 29. And here, Paul begins to systematically show that both Jews and Gentiles stand guilty before God. In the first 11 verses, Paul makes it clear that the morally decent people, which are the Jews, that they are guilty before God in the same way that the Gentiles are guilty before God. Paul goes through and he makes this point. He says those Jews who judge and condemn the grossly immoral Gentiles, those individuals are really condemning themselves. Because when they point the finger at the Gentiles and say, you're guilty of this sin, and you're guilty of this sin, and you're guilty of this sin, Paul's saying, you're guilty of the very same sins. You have done the same wrongs that they have done, and therefore you stand just as guilty and just as condemned as they do. Paul's point at the end in verse 11 is that God does not show partiality. He does not show favoritism when it comes to judgment. His standard will not be compromised for the Jewish people or for the Gentile people. His standard is the same for both Jews and Gentiles. When every single individual comes before the judgment throne of God and stands accountable to God, every individual will be judged by the same standard, the holiness of God. There aren't two separate standards for that. The standard is the same. And what Paul says in his point in this first section is that morally good Jews are just as guilty before God as the grossly immoral Gentiles. They've sinned and you've sinned. You both will stand before the judgment seat and will be rendered guilty before a holy God. Then Paul moves on, and he goes on now, and he begins to explain the basis by which God will judge those who are Gentiles, those who are not Jewish, and those who do not have the law of God. So the people without the law of God, without the revealed scriptures, without the Torah, without the Tanakh, without the Hebrew scriptures, those who don't have the written law of God, they too will be judged. And Paul reveals how they will be judged. Paul says that the Gentiles and the pagans will be judged according to the degree of knowledge of God's will that they have, that they possess. What degree of knowledge do they possess about God's righteous standard? Well, he says every person has a degree of knowledge about right and wrong from their conscience. Paul says that they have this innate knowledge, that they have the law of God written on their hearts. They know that it's wrong to steal. They know that it's wrong to lie. They know that it's wrong to murder. And their conscience affirms these things and coaches them and condemns them and shouts to them that they're guilty when they do these wrong things. And their conscience affirms and validates when they do the right thing. So the right and wrongs are known apart. So it's possible for right and wrong to be known apart from the law, apart from the scriptures, apart from the Old Testament. The Gentiles can still know what God's law and righteous standard is. Now, when they are judged, this is what they will find. Paul says that no person perfectly obeys their conscience, and therefore they're guilty before God. So he says the Jews who have the righteous standard of God, they are not in a place to judge or to condemn Gentiles for their gross immorality, because they will be held to the same standard, and they themselves are not holy as God is holy. But he says the Gentiles will be found guilty before God on the basis of the knowledge that they have. Brothers and sisters, this answers the question for us: what happens to people who never hear the gospel of Jesus Christ? Well, the answer is God will not hold them accountable for whether or not they received or rejected the gospel of Jesus Christ. If an individual dies and have never heard the gospel of Jesus Christ, God will not ask them, what did you do with the gospel of Jesus Christ? God will ask them, what did you do with the knowledge of right and wrong that was given to you? That was innate within you, that was inherent, that was natural within you. Did you perfectly obey the knowledge of right and wrong that was within you? And no person, Jew or Gentile, will be able to stand before God and say, I perfectly obeyed my conscience. I always chose to do the right thing all the time, at every moment, in thought, word, and deed. So God will not judge them based on Jesus Christ. God will judge them based on the knowledge of right and wrong that they possessed. And they too will be found guilty, just like those who have heard the gospel and just like those who have the knowledge of God through the scriptures. Paul then moves on, and he turns his attention now back to the Jews, and Paul declares that people with the law are guilty. He says, you who pass judgment on the Gentiles, you shouldn't, because you're really condemning yourself. God is not having two different standards, one for Jew and one for Gentile. His holy nature is the standard by which he will judge all people. And he says now Gentiles will be found guilty, and now he says those with the law will be found guilty. Paul is now challenging the Jewish thought, this popular thought within Judaism, that being Jewish and being a part of God's chosen people makes you righteous. Paul says, no, it doesn't make you righteous. You're not righteous before God because you're Jewish. You're not righteous before God because you were circumcised or because you were born to a specific race of people. Paul says, having the law of God does not make you does not make a Jewish person righteous. Hey, that's like saying us Christians. Just because we have the Bible, that doesn't mean that we're perfect. It doesn't mean that we're forgiven. It doesn't mean that we're righteous because we have a Bible. No, he says those who obey, those are the ones who are righteous before God. Jewish sins, Paul goes even further, and he says that Jews are guilty of breaking God's law. So he says, hey, you're actually more guilty than the Gentiles. They don't have the written word of God. They don't know the revealed will of God. You do, and yet you disobey in the same way that the Gentiles do. And so, Paul says, the Jews' sins are a reason why Gentiles reject the belief in the one true God. He says, yo, you're part of the reason why people don't believe in me. You're part of the reason why people don't accept me and why people don't walk in my way, because you're a hypocrite, because you're two-faced, because you live just like them, but yet somehow you think you're righteous just because you're a Jew or just because you have the law of God. So he says those who have the law are just as guilty before God as those who do not have the law. And then in the last section, Paul goes more in depth to actually impress upon and to break out of this Jewish thought that being Jewish makes you righteous. No, being circumcised, which is a sign of the covenant, the sign of the relationship between God and Israel. He says that doesn't even make you righteous. Paul says, he says in Romans chapter 2, verse 25, he says, circumcision has value if you observe the law. He says, if you observe the law, then your circumcision means something. The sign of the covenant means something. But he says, but if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. He says, it means nothing then. Circumcision, Paul's principle and his flow in this section is, Paul says, circumcision means nothing without obedience to God's law. Who cares if you're circumcised, if you're living lawlessly? That's like saying I've been baptized, but I'm still living like a non-Christian. Or I have 10 Bibles sitting on my bookshelf at my house. That doesn't make you a Christian. Being baptized doesn't make you a Christian. Those things mean something if it's an expression of the truth that's within you. And that's what Paul is conveying here. A true Jew is one who is a true Jew is the one whose outward actions truly convey and represent their right attitude towards God. Now, this is very interesting. Paul uses this expression here in this passage. He says that a man is a true Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart. This is not a new concept. This is not even a specifically Christian concept. This is found in the Old Testament, where it talks about a circumcision of the heart, where they are regenerated, they are born again, where they truly love God. They truly acknowledge God and desire to do God's will. So Paul here is smashing the Jewish thoughts and preconceived notions that being Jewish makes you righteous. Paul in Romans chapter 2 says, no, being Jewish doesn't make you righteous. You're guilty. Being a Gentile, you are guilty before God. Even without the law, he will render you guilty. So the Jews, they have the law, but they break the law, only showing that they too, like the Gentiles, are unrighteous. And Paul emphatically impresses upon them, hey, just because you're Jewish, just because you're born to this ethnic race, just because you have the sign of the covenant, doesn't make you righteous. So, whether you're a Jew or whether you're a Gentile, when God uses his holy nature as the standard by which he judges an individual, he says that the Jews are guilty and the Gentiles are guilty. They're both guilty before God. That's Romans chapter 2.